Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are tackling two concepts that are absolutely foundational, but let's be real, can be kind of confusing sometimes: preload and afterload. If you've ever wondered how the heart perfectly manages its volume, or how we actually manipulate it in a code or an emergency, you are right where you need to be. Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the big picture, cardiac output. Then we'll hit preload, the filling phase, and how to adjust it. After that, we'll look at afterload, the pumping pressure, and exactly how we can adjust that side of things too. All right, part one, the big picture, cardiac output. So before we even talk about the pump itself, we really need to understand its ultimate goal, right? And that's tissue perfusion. Cardiac output is simply the total amount of blood your heart pumps throughout the body every single minute. Our cells are incredibly demanding when it comes to oxygen. If this output drops, cells literally start to die, sending the patient into shock. So maintaining this output, it's quite literally a matter of life and death. So how does the body actually determine this output? Well, there's a master equation for cardiac output, and it's surprisingly simple. Heart rate times your stroke volume. If you know those two variables, you know exactly how much blood is moving through the system. Honestly, no advanced calculus required here. Let's zero in on stroke volume for a second. This is just the amount of blood pumped by a ventricle with each individual beat. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that stroke volume is affected by three primary things: contractility, preload, and afterload. Now, contractility is the heart's intrinsic squeeze. Super important, sure. But preload and afterload, those are the physical levers we can actually pull clinically to change how much blood the heart pushes out. So we're going to focus on those two today. Section 2. Preload, the filling phase. Whenever we talk about preload, we are strictly looking at the diastolic phase. That's that brief moment when the heart muscle relaxes, the AV valves open up, and blood just freely drains right down into the ventricles. Clinically speaking, preload is the amount the ventricles actually stretch at the very end of diastole, once they've completely filled with blood. Since it happens right at the tail end of that resting phase, you'll hear medical professionals call it end diastolic volume. Basically, it's the sheer volume of blood sitting in that ventricle right before the big squeeze. Look, if end diastolic volume sounds like dense medical jargon, just picture a water balloon. Imagine the ventricle is the balloon, and you're filling it up from a faucet. Preload isn't the water itself, right? Preload is how much the actual rubber physically stretches. The more volume you dump in, the more stretch you get, well, up until it pops anyway. Though thankfully, our ventricles are a whole lot more resilient than party balloons. Moving on to section 3, how to adjust preload. So why do we care so much about this ventricular stretch? Well, because in clinical scenarios, like if a patient is bleeding out in hypovolemic shock, or the complete opposite, drowning in their own fluids during heart failure, we absolutely have to step in. We essentially have two goals here, depending on the emergency. We either need to increase preload, stretching those ventricles more to boost stroke volume, or we need to decrease preload to give an overburdened heart a break. It's a direct cause and effect game based on blood volume and venous return. Let's look at how we actually increase preload. Say a patient is in hypovolemic shock. They literally lack fluid volume. The easiest fix? Administer IV fluids. You're directly adding volume into the venous system, which returns more blood to the heart and cranks up that end diastolic stretch. Another trick up our sleeve is using vasopressors. These drugs stimulate the sympathetic nervous system to cause vasoconstriction, literally clamping down and narrowing the blood vessels. That forced squeeze shoots a ton of venous blood right back to the heart, filling up the ventricle and boom, increasing our preload. But hey, what if the patient is in fluid overload? We've got to decrease that ventricular stretch. One way is with diuretics, like furosemide. These force the kidneys to physically pull extra fluid out of the bloodstream so the patient can simply urinate it out. Less total volume means less blood rushing back to the heart. Alternatively, we use vasodilators, like nitroglycerin. Instead of clamping vessels down, these open them wide. And this brilliantly illustrates our point. When vessels dilate, the blood just kind of pulls out in the periphery. That decreases venous return, meaning way less blood makes it back to the heart, which drops the preload and finally gives those overstretched ventricles a much-needed break. Okay, let's pivot to section 4, afterload, the pumping pressure. So if preload is all about volume and stretch during relaxation, afterload is the complete opposite. It's all about resistance during contraction. By definition, afterload is the pressure that the ventricles must actively fight against just to push open those semilunar valves and eject blood out of the heart. Think of it like trying to push open a heavy door while someone on the exact opposite side is leaning all their weight against it. That annoying resistance on the other side, that is your afterload, and it's heavily dictated by the vascular resistance inside the arteries. Now, keep in mind that the right and left sides of the heart face very different workloads. The right ventricle's only job is to send blood next door to the lungs, so it just has to overcome pulmonary vascular resistance to pop open that pulmonic valve. But the left ventricle, it has a massive job. It pumps blood to the entire body, from your brain to your toes. So it has to overcome systemic vascular resistance to force the aortic valve open. That's a huge difference in effort. Let's move to section 5 and see how this builds. How to adjust afterload. Just like with preload, we absolutely have to know what cranks up this resistance so we can jump in and fix it. Several nasty conditions can drastically increase afterload, forcing the heart to work overtime. Severe vasoconstriction narrows the arteries, which absolutely skyrockets systemic vascular resistance. Then you have things like pulmonary hypertension, which damages and narrows the lung arteries, massively increasing the right ventricle's afterload. And of course, mechanical issues. Take aortic stenosis. If the aortic valve itself gets stiff and narrow, that poor left ventricle has to generate an unbelievable amount of pressure just to force blood through that tiny little opening. When you compare a high afterload state to a low afterload state, what you're really looking at is an exhausted, overworked muscle versus a relieved one. High afterload and high vascular resistance totally go hand in hand. The higher the pressure outside those valves, the harder the ventricles must violently squeeze just to achieve normal, everyday tissue perfusion. It's totally exhausting for the heart. So how do we fix this and lower that afterload? Well, we once again reach for medications like vasodilators. By widening the arteries, we drastically slash that vascular resistance. It is literally like taking the heavy weight right off that door we talked about earlier. By dropping the pressure, we lower the afterload, which allows an exhausted, failing ventricle to easily push blood out and maintain cardiac output without working itself to death. So the crucial point comes down to this, your master cheat sheet for hemodynamics. You want to increase preload? Give IV fluids or vasopressors. Need to decrease preload? Hit them with diuretics or vasodilators. And definitely remember that those exact same vasodilators are your absolute best tool for simultaneously dropping vascular resistance and decreasing your afterload. It's a real 2-for-1 deal. Which leaves us with a final thought to really test your new understanding of cardiac mechanics. Imagine a patient rolls in with wildly high systemic blood pressure and a completely exhausted left ventricle that is just struggling to pump. Based on the mechanics of preload and afterload, we literally just walked through how exactly would you intervene to save their tissue perfusion. Think about the specific levers you can pull right now to make that left ventricle's job easier. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope it brought some real clarity to the incredible